Right. So, what we are going to discuss today's session about the developer certification, associate developer certification exam pattern. Okay. So, because all these days we discussed about the Guidewire developer part. That is what something we are discussing earlier. But whereas when it comes to the today session, let me provide you a high-level glimpse over what exactly developer associate exam must consist of, right? So, what is that being into development or a developer? One must be knowing. So, in this regard, so when it comes to the developer associate exam, let us understand what are the different roles that are available in Guidewire. Because, of course, as in when you are planning to write the developer associate examination, but let us understand what are the different roles you see when you are working in the Guidewire application, because Guideware, a prominent property and casualty insurance application, which we are using for quite some time. So first you need to understand what are the different roles we have in Guideware. Okay, because certifications will also be different. It depends on the kind of role what we have taken. So the first one about Guideware developer exam, Guideware developers will be there, because when it comes to the Guideware and all that, so we have developers are available, but whoever the developers who will be focusing on writing the code for the project of the functionalities what we have created, right? So all these things will be taken care of by the developer itself. That is what something which normally we see whenever we are working on the Guideware point of view. That is point number one. Developers will be there. So after developers, generally the next one about the business analyst roles we can see, because business analysts are the people who will be gathering the requirements and necessary functional requirements, whatever is needed for the project will be provided by the business analyst team. So business analyst more or less uh, to gather the requirements for any of the project, whatever we have, whatever the required projects we are developing. Let's say, for example, Guideware Policy Center, we are configuring according to the organizational needs. So business analyst has to gather the requirements by understanding what are the different business goals and government mandates which are to be managed with. That is where generally the role of a BA comes into picture. Next, we can see the testing roles as well. Tester roles will also be there. Tester roles focus is more on the testing perspective. I can call it as QA as well, right? So quality analyst and all that. Next, if there is any kind of support team and all, everything will be there. In addition to that, you can see a role called Guideware Architect. Architect means people who develop solution architecture for a particular problem. So those people are called as architects, right? So when it comes to the Guideware certification point of view, or certifications when someone is writing, developers certifications were different. At the same time, even business analyst certifications were different, and tester certifications will be different. Now, again, in these roles, there are different categories we have. Categories, I can say, right? So categories means, let's say a person who wants to write a certification in the beginner level, that is different. The certifications were different. People who are in the intermediate level, their certifications will be as separate. At the same time, people whoever have rich experience in working on the Guideware, their certifications will be of different. So let us not discuss about those things. That is a different thing altogether. But end of the day, one of the major element when in we need to understand about the roles and roles were these. Okay, developer as a business analyst, at the same time tester. These are the three different roles we have. Now, what about the Guidewire Developer Associate? Okay, this is what something with one must be knowing, right? So, what is uh, Developer Guidewire Associate certification is all about? And what is that a person has to be good with? And what is that a person has to be familiar with? Normally, associate is an examination which majorly try to understand what are all the different products Guidewire consists of, because this is all on a high level note. This is nothing to do with implementation. This is nothing to do with implementing a particular solution or something. It is nothing to do with it. It is to do with what are the different products which are comes under the Guideware. So that understanding and how these applications or the products performing, right? So how it is performing, that sort of understanding is always required. So it's always needed for, so see, uh, right. So it is always essential for us to have a fundamental understanding about the Guideware part. That is point number one. Okay. So what are all the fundamental topics in context to the Guideware is what something which normally we must be knowing, right? So you must be knowing about the basic understanding over the Guideware application. We must be having a basic understanding about the kind of products which are involved in it, right? So what are the different products do we have? So either it can be policy center, it can be testing, billing, it can be claims. It can be to an extent possible underwriting, right? So overall fundamental knowledge over the Guideware and how it works and how it functions is what something which normally one should be good with. This is point number one. Point number two, when it comes to the Guideware Certificate Developer Associate examination, whenever we are trying to understand about the associate exam from the developer perspective, first of all, we must be knowing about two things, because as far as the implementation of the Guideware application in reality, either it can be a policy center, it can be billing, it can be claims, it can be of any other thing. Developmental perspective or implemental perspective, I can say, not only developmental perspective, but when it comes to the implementation perspective, right? So when it comes to the implementation perspective, we must be knowing about the difference between two things. So one is about the configuration, and second is called integration. One is configuration, second is integration, right? So these are the two things. So what is configuration and what is integration? Anyway, you must be having some idea, but let me repeat you. So configuration majorly focusing on configuring an application according to the business rules and government mandates in the organization. That is what we call it as configuration. Means, let's say there is some policy administrative application which a property and casualty insurance company is using for a very long time. Now they want to configure the application. A new Guideware policy center is what something which they were planning to take. So whenever they are planning to take a new Guideware application, it's always important for them to configure it, configure according to the organization business rules. That is important. Means they have to configure customization. To make it very simple, I can say this is called customization. Customization need to be made. according to the rules and government mandates, it has to be configured. That is what something which normally people will look for. Because product, whatever the required features that are needed, everything were existed. But what we are doing is that we are customizing it according to the organization structure. That is all something which normally are we doing over here. That's where generally we call it as configuration is all about. So that's the reason if you see many of the job opportunities, either for a developer role or for a business analyst role, you see majorly the roles you see in the configuration front, not on the integration, more of configuration. Because when the people required professionals to work on Guidewire, most of the times whenever we are planning to use a new application, then we required people, okay, to perform some activities in that. So what kind of activity is that? That activity is nothing but configuration, right? So someone should be there to configure the application. That is what something which normally people see. So configuration is one of the key and important element, especially when we are working on the application front, right? Is what something which normally we do. So configuration is the first point. So configuration experience, configuration knowledge is required. Second, integration. Integration means Guidewire application has existed. Now you are integrating this Guidewire application with some other external or internal systems, right? So how you are going to create an API for that, right? So API development, we need to create multiple APIs for that. Either it can be RESTful API or something of that sort. SOAP API, all that. So we need to create API. So we need to call these web services to develop that. And we need to develop a communication between two different applications. This is all something comes under the configuration integration point. So there is an immense understanding over the configuration perspective to an extent possible is what something which normally being into business analysis, we must be good developer, we must be good enough. At the same time, some kind of understanding over the integration perspective is always beneficial to us, because when we are working on this Guidewire Developer Associate certification exam, it's always important even for us to understand about the configuration perspective and as well as the integration perspective even. Okay, that is what something which we must be good with. So when it comes to the Guidewire Association exam itself is concerned, so there are major areas we have to be focused are few, right? So because I think you hope you understood about the difference between Guidewire configuration to integration, if I am not wrong. Am I right? Yes or no?
Yes, yeah, I understand.
Right. So configuration, what I have discussed with you so far is the difference between configuration and integration. Configuration, majorly configuring the application according to the organization rules, business rules, etc. Integration, where you are integrating this application to other things. That is something it's required. Now, when it comes to the areas of focus, when it comes to the Guidewire point of view, especially from the point of configuration perspective, there are four major areas I can say, right? So the first one about the user interface area, because sometimes there will be some scenario based questions we come across where we must be able in a position to answer it properly, right? So scenario based learning is all something we are doing now, right? So what are the different scenarios we come across, right? So how do you answer it? And what are the steps that are involved to perform a particular activity? This is what something which normally we get the questions. So when it comes to the configuration perspective, because if you want to configure Guideware application in your organization, User interface configuration is the first area. What is user interfaces? User interfaces means whatever the front end development or whatever that we are using on screen, right? So for either for the input purpose or something like, or to have a structure of the application, means if you want to create any kind of application, there must be some layout of the application is required. For a structure of the application to manage with, user interfaces are something which is useful. So there are different user interfaces we have. Being into Guidewire development side, how to configure user interfaces is one thing which being a developer you must be good with. Point number one. And do remember, this is all something from the configuration point of view. I must say that because that's the reason why detailed explanation about the configuration and integration and how it is different I was mentioned before. So user interface configuration is one of the core and important area being into Guidewire development. When you're writing this associate exam is what something you must be good with. This is point number one. Second, we must be knowing about the data models, right? So that is data model configuration is also one of the key and important element. Data model means, let's say you are developing an application. Normally applications will be having three different layers. One, we have a presentation layer, whatever the user interfaces and all everything comes under that category. Second, business or logic layer. The third is called as data layer. Let me draw here 1 minute. For example, if you take an application, for example, here I'll write. Let's say if this is an application, okay. So application will be having three layers. The first layer, the second layer, third layer, okay, three layers. Now this first layer is called presentation layer, right? Whatever the presentations we do, everything comes under the part of PL, which is called presentation layer. Okay, this is point number one. Means whatever the user interface creations we do, right? So whatever the user interface developments will be taken care of by us. Whatever we do, everything comes under the presentation layer point of view. Means you are presenting something on screen where people will understand this better. This is what something we call it as PL, which stands for presentation layer. User interface configurations, right? So all these things are comes under that category, that layer. Second, business logic layer. This is where generally business logic, this I will explain later. Okay, business logic layer we call it as. Business logic means if you want to develop a logic, there you will be writing. Being a developer, our major role will lie on that category. The third one about the data layer. Okay, data layer. This is where generally these data models and all everything are applicable in this category. Data layer means if you are developing an application, there is some X amount of data will be stored in the database. So what kind of database are we using? Point number one. Point number two, let's say, for example, using some user interface, there is some input you are giving. For example, policy has been taken by someone. So where you need to record policy information of a particular individual. How do you record this? Point number, first point, okay, how do you record this? Once you have recorded the data, where the recorded data will be stored? There must be some data, there must be some database where all the records will be stored over there. Is it stored, the data will be stored randomly? No, there must be some structurized format of data. Tables is what required. This is written in general in context to data tables, we call it as data dictionary. Okay, data dictionary, data table creation is required. It means, for example, you are mentioning about the policyholder number. So it has to store the policyholder number in the column of a policyholder. If it's a policy number, for example, if it's a policy ID number, it has to store in the policy ID number itself. That's how it has to store. Okay, that is how generally that storage must be. Means depends on the kind of column which that represents. The data has to be stored into that. That is what generally normally happen when we are working on the Guidewire application. Okay, so it will that information has to be stored exactly. So once it is stored, whenever there is a need, extracting the data from there is what something which normally we do, right? So for that, generally there are different queries we write using SQL, right? So different queries. So SQL is a query language which is normally used to extract the data from the database. For that, generally SQL queries, etc., will be used. SQL, MySQL, all that stuff, right? So that's what something which normally we do. So in reference to the database data modeling is concerned, database creation is concerned, database management is concerned, there are some models to be created. That is where generally data model come into picture. So depends on the kind of application we are developing. There is always important for us to create some data model. At the same time, we must be having some idea over the data dictionaries. What are the different data dictionaries we have? That sort of understanding is always required. So that's the reason why configuring the data model is also one of the core and important element. Being into Guidewire Developer Association exam, one must be good with. This is point number 2. Data model means creation of data models, right? So at the same time, knowing about what are the different data dictionaries we have. Next, if you want to create and configure the data, configure the data model, what are the steps that are required to follow? Because what are the steps that are required to follow is one of the key and important element one should be known with. This is all comes under the data model perspective. The third one about, yeah, let me delete. Yeah. The third one about application logic. Application logic. This is where sometime back, if you remember, I have told you. If you see the layers of the applications, we have 3. One is about user interface layer. Whatever the presentation layers and all everything comes under this category, right? User interfaces and all comes under the presentation layer part. So whatever the databases we are creating, data dictionaries, data management, everything comes under the data model, right? So this is the third layer, which I have shown you some time back. In middle, whatever the logic we are applying is called application logic. For example, you are a user, right? So you have given 1 plus 2 on the screen. Whenever you are pressing the enter button, you got a result as 3. How you got this? How a system has understood the instructions. System has understood the instructions because you have given a number called 1 as well as 2. In between, there is a logic you have used, which is a plus symbol. Plus symbol is the one which is used by you as a user. So plus represents addition of numbers. That was the context. So being a developer, what you have done, you have written a logic behind, because you and me speaking in a language called English so that we understood well. But how come system understand? System should understand in language, such a language that is called programming language. Programming is a language. It's one of the language. It can be any programming. It can be Java, it can be Gosu, right? So it can be Python, it can be Swift programming, right? So it can be Kotlin, right? So it can be of any programming language. So there must be some programming language we have to use to provide some instructions to the system, because system cannot understand the language what we speaks. So developer is the person who has to write a logic for that. That's where generally this application logic comes into picture. Means you are developing a logic between the two things, right? So between means you are developing a logic. Being a developer, we are developing a logic for adding 2 numbers. Adding 2 numbers is a logic we are implementing. So whenever we are implementing that logic, automatically you are getting a result called 1 plus 2 means automatically you get a result called 3. Or it can be 500 plus 300, right? So whatever it is, end of the day, you will be getting a result because there is a logic which we are implementing here for adding of two numbers, because plus is a symbol, you have used it. If it is a subtraction or it is a multiplication or a division, based on that, it will come into picture. So application logic configuration is also one of the core and important element being into Guidewire developer that one must be good with as far as association is concerned, exam is concerned, right? So application logic is also one of the core and important element one must be good with. So how to develop the application logic, right? So when you are going to develop a logic for the particular functionality or something, or for a couple of functionalities, what kind of configuration you wants to make. These are all the things which normally one must be good with. Next, fourth, last but not least, as I already stated earlier, repeating the same, having a knowledge over some integration part is also required. Because once the guideware configuration is done, it can be of any module. So once the configuration of the guideware done, what is that we have to do? You have to make use of this application for our business activity. If you want to use it, what is required? It is always important for us to integrate that, right? So integration is all something which we have to be performed with. If you want to integrate what is required, so there must be some integration you need to develop between two different applications for the communication purpose. For the benefit of communication, you need to develop that logic, okay? You need to develop the logic. You need to develop a communication between two different applications. So for that, this is always important for us to create some integration process. Understanding over the integration is always preferable, is always needed. That's where generally integration come into picture. So application logic is important. At the same time, integration is also important. So when it comes to the Guidewire Developer Associate examination, so understanding over the configuration perspective from the user interfaces is needed. Data model is needed. Application logic is required. At the same time, having some knowledge over the integration part, because you need to develop, you need to access some data from policy center to manage our claims. There must be an integration should happen in between. So then only we can perform it. That's where generally this integration comes into picture. So these are the major areas being into Guidewire Developer Association. One must be good with as far as the certification itself is concerned. This is what something which normally we must be good and familiar with. This is what something which are we learning. Of course, earlier we have already initiated and we have covered something, but formally for the certification part, I'll be discussing about these things from tomorrow onwards. Clear to you?